First, we have Chris McDowell, we'll introduce in a minute, talking about the Stephney Hoard fact or fiction. And later, we're going to hear from Dilly Kenny talking about Maryland paper currency of the 18th century. But for now, let me start by introducing Chris McDowell. Now, I will say that I feel like I should have a gavel and say all rise, because as many of you, as some of you know, we have a great honor in the club of having sitting now a sitting judge who was recently appointed to be a state court trial judge of the great state of Ohio. So it's a reflected honor, I guess, on the club to have such an august person leading us. The other thing I want to say about Chris is, I don't know when he sleeps, because in addition to being a prolific author of books and articles, often lengthy articles, and taking over CNL and keeping that going, and then starting Gene and being the editor of Gene, of course, being the president of our club, and an incredibly hardworking editor, president of our club, I can attest. He has a great legal career. He's been an attorney, practicing attorney, and now a judge. I don't know when he sleeps. So without further ado, I'll give you Chris McDowell, Honorable Chris McDowell, for the Stephney Hoard fact or fiction. All right. We hear the lights a little bit. That's good. Yeah, that needs to be helpful.
Well, I decided to pick a non-controversial topic. So it's the Stephney Hoard. Perhaps no other topic actually is more controversial within colonial numismatics than the Stephney Hoard, whether it is fact or fiction, real or fake. It has lots of detractors. It also has lots of fans. Before we get into the meat of the Stephney Hoard, the first thing that we should discuss is what is the legend of the Stephney Hoard? What is it that began this whole thing? And so I'm going to read from Walter Breen's unpublished manuscript about the Stephney Hoard, how it was found and how it all began. So according to Mr. Breen, during 1950, in the course of some excavations on the site of an old barn on a pre-Revolutionary War estate in the town of Stephney in Fairfield County, Connecticut, there was brought to light an antique iron kettle, apparently completely filled with earth. The kettle appeared to be of 18th century manufacture. It was undamaged and probably had lain undisturbed since its burial next to one of the posts in the barn. The barn itself was said to have been built around 1760. From within the kettle, the owners found a quantity of well-encrusted coppers and brass coins. They sold all of these, though retaining the kettle, to Stacks of New York, by whom a few of the choicer specimens were resold after cleaning with boiling water. This begins the story of the Stephney Hoard. This is the legend that has always been attached to it. This is the item that is of great controversy. The first thing that we're going to discuss, Walter Breen never saw the kettle in question. Dr. Phil Mossman wrote about 70 pages in the C4 newsletter on the Stephney Hoard at one point, in which he actually dug deep into the science of an iron kettle to determine whether an iron kettle could have kept the hoard safe for all these years from 1788, discussed this, until 1950. So I looked up some pictures of iron kettle because it was never really determined. So it could have been this kind of a kettle with a nice little lid, or it could have been more of a kettle like this, which is kind of what I always imagined the kettle looked like. These coins were found in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And the geography here will later on become very important as to the significance of the hoard. So it's good for you to sort of visualize where these were found. Stephney is about where the F is in Fairfield, there in Fairfield County. And you'll see New Haven County is next to it. New York is to its left. And north is Rupert, Vermont. And so all three of these places, Orange Lake, where Machen's Mills is, about a little left to the Y in New York, and Rupert is kind of the picture that up there where Vermont would be. Whatever you think of the Hoard and the Hoard's story, one thing is very clear: the coins are not made up. No one can doubt that. The coins are real. And so we're going to discuss in depth, in some respects, the coins themselves. So recently, I discovered, through the help of some other people, and I've had access to Walter Breen's original manuscripts of the Hoard. So Walter Breen, that if you knew him, was very fastidious in his note-taking, and he wrote copious notes about the Hoard as he was investigating it in 1951, 1952. Walter Breen always intended to write a more expansive article on the Hoard, which he never did. The manuscript to that was actually found by Dr. Mossman. It's now in the A&S library. There's other copies of it going around. In this unpublished manuscript, Walter Breen details the items that were found in the Hoard. Because there are so many of them, I can't go through each one and what type of coins and so forth. So we're going to talk in some generalities about the content of the Hoard. The first thing is there was one Nova Iborak, which is kind of the standout thing as compared to the rest of the Hoard. These are according to Walter Breen's numbering of the Hoard items themselves. So number one, according to Breen, is the Nova Iborak. Numbers 2 through 73 this is Walter Breen's 1951 language, coins purporting to be British and Irish halfpence. And so there are 72 of these items. As we dig into it, what Walter Breen knew in 1951, 1952, our knowledge has expanded greatly on. A lot of these coins that he lumps into British and Irish halfpence are actually Machen's Mills pieces. The bulk of the Hoard consists of Connecticut coppers. Items 74 through 81 are 1785 dated Connecticut coppers. The numbers 82 through 99 are 1786 dated Connecticut coppers. And then the bulk of the Hoard is items 100 through items 174. 74 coins in total are Connecticut coppers dated 1787. Items 175 through 178 are 1788 dated Connecticut coppers. Items 179 through 181 we'll discuss later. Walter Breen believed that these items, these Vermont coppers, were not actually part of the Hoard, but were actually put into the items that were handed to him, purporting to be part of the Hoard. Walter Breen, when he looked at the Vermont coppers, found that the state of wear of these items was very heavy, and he believed they looked nothing like the rest of the items in the Hoard. And as we'll discuss, this is when he worked at Stack's Bowers in 1951, and he felt that the Stack's family had included some extra items into the Hoard. So although the Hoard consists of 181 copper and brass coins, Walter Breen believed that items 179 through 181 actually were not part of the original Hoard. In addition to the three items that Walter Breen believed were added to the Hoard, in order to understand the Hoard, we have to understand that Walter Breen was not the one who purchased the Hoard across the table. The coins were purchased months before they were ever given to Walter Breen to look at. And in that intervening time, there were certain coins that were sold from the Hoard. We don't know what varieties of coins these were. We really don't know how many coins total were actually sold from the Hoard. But according to Walter Breen, about 20 odd Connecticut's and 8 Vermonts were sold from the Hoard. According to Norman Bryant, who purchased most of the items from the Hoard, he believed that where he was told by the Stacks family that only 4 Connecticut's were sold from the Hoard. One of those was a pristine Connecticut copper that was the most expensive item that was sold from the Hoard, and it was sold for $35. We don't know even today what variety that was, what coin that was, but probably if you ever find an MS-66 Connecticut copper anywhere, it could be that coin that was sold from the Hoard. So one of the things that we have to understand when we look at the Hoard itself is it's not something that was dug in situ and then a group of archaeologists and scientists came upon it and studied it like it was King Tut's tomb. The Hoard was slightly, and I think that's properly put, slightly contaminated before Walter Green was able to examine it, both contaminated with a few items added to it and contaminated with some items taken from it. But by and by, the 181 coins, the 178 coins that constitute the Hoard are all from the Hoard itself. And as we look at some of these coins, they do have certain characteristics, if I may, that you can say really adds to them and shows that they're from the Hoard. So you can see there in greater detail Walter Green's explanation for why items 179 through 180 he believed had been added to the Hoard. He wrote, and this is in his unpublished manuscript, both examples are so much worn that I have doubts whether they actually belong with the Hoard as was claimed, though they were indeed not in the same bag in which the other coins had been kept after sale to Stacks. And then he details what the Vermont was, that's item 181. Walter Green is an integral part of the Stephney Hoard. You can't study the Stephney Hoard without really coming into direct contact with Walter Green, something that is a little unsavory, I must say. And Walter Green, his veracity, Walter Green's character, Walter Green's truthfulness really comes into play when we examine the Hoard. And so one of the initial questions that I had, I'll admit that initially I was a skeptic of the Hoard, whether the Hoard was real or not. And a lot of my skepticism really centered around Walter Green and whether he himself had invented the Hoard. I do not believe now that Walter Green invented the Hoard, but I went into a deep dive into Walter Green's life, and I'm going to discuss some of this with you now. A lot of it is probably going to be new to a lot of you. When I was in college, when we were studying the Roman and Carthaginian wars, at one point my professor said, "Put down your pens, I'm going to tell you about Hannibal and how he stuck a red hot poker in his eye." So it's because it's such a story that it just takes away from the rest of what we're going to talk about. But I do need to have you all understand a little bit about Walter Green, particularly is who was Walter Green in 1951. We all know who Walter Green became. And a lot of people think, well, Walter Green went into a slow slide into what he became. And so let's look at who Walter Green really was in 1951. Walter Green described his own childhood in 1978 in Pennywise magazine. On his own, he provided an autobiography of himself to Pennywise. So no one forced him to say these things. He said them on his own. And I think it's important that we understand this. First, he said that he was born on September 30th, 1930 in San Antonio, Texas, and that he was, quote, abandoned, foundling, raised by an adopted father, a traveling salesman, whose name I bear, and an adoptive mother, of whom the less said, the better. Walter Green created his own fictional life. He lived a lot. And so the question is, is it all a lie? Is there truth in any of this? When we look at Walter Green in 1951, was he a liar? Was he a person whose credibility that we can rely upon? Because a lot of what we know of the Hoard, we have to first look at Walter Green. I'm going to tell you some information about Walter Breen leading up to 1951 because it's important for background. This is Walter Breen's mother, her name was Mary Helen Mell. And this is a photograph of her circa 1920. In 1920, she was married to a man named Charles Mell, and they lived in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And they lived there with their 3 children. Approximately 1926, Mary abandoned, deserted her family. One evening, she just disappeared. And she reappeared in San Antonio, Texas. And it was in San Antonio, Texas, not in 1930, as Walter Breen would have you believe, but on September 5th, 1928, that Walter Breen was born. This is Walter Breen's birth certificate, which was actually filled out by his mother in, I believe, 1942. And I'm gonna go through a couple of things because this becomes a very strange story, to say the least. First, you'll note her name she puts her name as Helen H. Brown. That is her maiden name, the mother's maiden name. And then she signs her name as Nellie Mell Breen. So when Walter Breen was born, his mother went by the name Nellie Mell Breen, using her name from her abandoned family back in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Just so that you don't believe that Walter was elected. So first, there's several names she uses in this: Brown, Mell, Breen, and so forth. This is Walter Breen's World War II draft card. You'll note on the draft card, it's signed by Mrs. Mary H. Mell. And then below that is Walter Breen's signature. So Walter Breen was very much aware that his mother was known by the name of Mary H. Mell. And when this draft card was signed, the word Breen, she didn't even use the name Breen. Where's this going? Well, when Walter Breen was born, Mary was still married to Charles Mell back in Parkersburg. The story doesn't end there. This is Walter Breen's father's death certificate. I'd like to note a couple of things on the death certificate. Let's go back real quick to the birth certificate. When we look at the birth certificate, it says that Walter's father was the manager of a creamery. So keep that in mind, that he's the manager of a creamery, and that his name is Walter Henry Breen. So here's his death certificate. His death certificate, this is Walter Breen's father's death certificate. It says that his date of birth is October 18th, 1892, and that he is born in Illinois. Here is a man named Walter H. Green, G-R-E-E-N-E. This is a World War I draft card. This gentleman, Mr. Green, his birthday is October 18th, 1892. The same birthday as Walter H. Breen, Sr. And you'll also note here that he works in a creamery. Here is a Parkersburg, West Virginia directory from 1926, shortly before Mary Mell abandoned her family. Above, we see Walter H. Green, the man that we were talking about in the World War I certificate. And this Mr. Green lives next door to the Mells. If you could see a street, it is 1601 Percy Avenue. And you will see that his occupation is the home dairy, is where he worked. Now remember that Mr. Green, his World War I card says that he worked in a creamery, and here he is living next to the Breens. Below is the entry for Charles F. and Mary H. Mell in their home address of 1527 Percy Avenue. What happened is that Mr. Breen abandoned his wife and his 5 children, including his infant child, ran off with the next door neighbor to San Antonio, Texas. And it was there in 1928 that Mr. Green changed his name to Mr. Breen. So Green becomes Breen, and they have a little Breen named Walter H. Breen, who's the man that you all came to know. So at the time Walter Breen was born, his mother was married to another person, and his father was married to another person. Walter Breen was not a foundling. He was not an orphan. He was the product of 2 married people to other individuals who had absconded to Texas and who in 1928 had a child. Walter Breen would say, according to someone in this room, that he was born in 1930 and that he was the Lindbergh baby, because the Lindbergh baby was also born in 1930. Walter Breen wasn't the Lindbergh baby. He wasn't a foundling, and he wasn't an orphan. But like any great lie, there's a little kernel of truth to what Walter Breen had to say. Well, as you can imagine, a man of the character of Walter Breen soon in Texas found another young lady who he liked better than Mrs. Mel, and he then left her and married a 3rd wife and went to Chicago, where they had a child who he named Walter Breen. So there are actually 2 Walter Breens that were running around at one time. A couple of years later, Mary went back to West Virginia. She went up the river to Wheeling, West Virginia, where she worked at, of all places, a convent. And while at the convent, I'm sure that she couldn't exactly tell the nuns the full story of her child. And so I believe that it was at that point that this whole story became concocted. Now, here's the nugget of truth. This is a picture of the children's home in Wheeling, West Virginia. In Wheeling, West Virginia, there was an orphanage. Probably Mary found that she could not exactly hang out with nuns with the child, so she put Walter into the orphanage school. So he was at the orphanage school, but he was not an orphan. He had 2 parents, although 2 people of dubious character. He didn't live in the orphanage, but his mother lived about 4 blocks away in the convent. Well, where did Walter Breen go from here? That's, of course, you know this man, it's not Walter Breen, that's John J. Hoard. He's the next person of dubious character that comes into the story. So what happened is, to Walter Breen's credit, and Walter Breen, of course, is a man who's complex. He's not all bad, just like everyone. He's neither all good nor all bad. Walter Breen enlisted in the United States Army Air Force, and about 3 months into his step with the Army Air Force, he was savagely beaten. According to some people that I've talked to, Walter did admit that he was beaten because he was a homosexual. And he was pretty much beaten almost to death. And he was placed into a VA hospital and discharged from the Army Air Force. He was given a Section 8. And if any of you all ever watched MASH, you're pretty familiar with what a Section 8 was. So Walter Breen was given a Section 8 discharge from the United States Army Air Force. One thing that I will say about Walter Breen that his military records show is true. His military records show that he had an IQ of 141, as measured by the Army Air Force, which truly does make Walter Breen a genius. And probably it's not a 1-for-1 with the IQ scale that we use. In all likelihood, Walter Breen had an IQ in excess of 150, which really places him in the 99th percentile of all human beings on Earth. So whatever else you can say about Walter Breen, he wasn't a dummy. He might have liked to try to get people to believe his lies, but he was no dummy. So Walter Breen first goes into the hospital, but his time in the hospital is not short. He spends about 1.5 years in the VA hospital first in Texas, and then he's moved to Boston. In the hospital that he stays at in Boston, I think that it would be correct to really describe it as a mental hospital. I don't know if it's because the United States Army Air Force wanted to cure him of his homosexuality, or he had other issues that were going on, but he was really in it's called Cushing, and it was a mental hospital there. From Cushing, Walter was transferred to a VA hospital in New York, outside New York City. And it was there where he began to correspond with his lifelong friend, John J. Ford Jr. John Ford introduced Walter to numismatics, although Walter had joined the ANA a couple of years before, but it was really John J. Ford who helped Walter Green get his first job in numismatics. Ford introduced Green to Waite Bryan. Raymond Waite, thank you. And he gave Walter a job working in Washington, D.C., going through the archives. And then John Ford helped Walter get a job at Stax. Stax, about late 1950. And really, what Walter's job was not just to work at Stax, but to be, and it's very apparent from Walter's communication, but to be John J. Ford's inside man at Stax. Walter Green would communicate regularly with Mr. Ford. He would type up messages that were about the size of a cigarette pack, type them up, and give them to Mr. Ford, telling Mr. Ford about the new things that had come in to Stax, how much they had paid for them, and what was going on. And so, in this way, you get what are really some of Walter's unadulterated comments concerning the Hoard, because it was just such a note that Mr. Green wrote Mr. Ford. Now, Walter, for whatever reason, liked to lie to people, but I believe that one person that he generally told the truth to was Mr. Ford. And he really has, at this point, no motive to lie to John Ford. Although, again, Mr. Green has his own problems, Mr. Ford has his own problems. But here is, this is kind of like the Alger Hess pumpkin paper kind of documents here, where it's all sort of small, typed up, probably folded up and handed off to Mr. Ford. Here's what Walter said to Ford. The Connecticut Ford found an old iron kettle during excavation and raising an old barn in a town between, so I've helped put in brackets some of his abbreviations, between Waterbury and Dunbury, Connecticut. Say again? Danbury, thank you. It contained originally upward of 200 pieces. Morton M. Stax, he calls Morton M., says nearly 250, but many choice ones are sold. There were about 8 Vermont head types and all rest Brit, halfpence, and Connecticut's, not counting the single Nova Ivorak, which is Benjamin Stack. Bought the Hoard intact some months ago for S, which is Stack. So here's some news, for $250. The coins were undamaged. The old pot was intact, but most had a heavy incrustation on them. This yielded to ordinary cleaning, boiling water. This occasion the friends were from Walter. And those now remaining from the Hoard are in conditions far above average. There were no New Jersey coppers, nor coins of other states except Vermont's. The town in WC, which is Western Connecticut. These were found in a summer resort and now site of artists, actors colony. How much of this I can publish depends, I suppose, on what S. Stax will allow to be published. So this is what Walter told to Ford when he originally came into contact with the Hoard. So Benjamin Stax, who lived from 1925 to 1984, purchased the Hoard for $250 around February 1951. Again, whatever else you may think of the hoard, the coins are absolutely real. And it was given to Breen to examine around June 1951. So in between February and June is when a couple of Vermonts were added and when the other coins were sold. In a 2018 Coin World article about growing up in a numismatic family, Harvey Stack described his cousin Ben as a man known for driving a hard bargain. He was a great negotiator. Indeed, he was. Because if he bought this hoard, which he did, as we know, for $250, it might be one of the great colonial deals of the century. To put it into perspective, $1 in 1951 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $12.30 today, meaning Ben purchased the intact hoard for $3,075 in 2025. As you'll see, many of the individual coins from the hoard sell for far in excess of $3,075. So Breen's initial impression of the coins and their conditions were shared with Hoard, describing how the hoard arrived in a sack. So Breen also communicated with Mr. Ford, telling him what did the coins look like, how did he receive them. If you recall, the iron kettle is gone. I don't believe that anybody at Stacks ever saw the iron kettle. They were just told the iron kettle story. Breen, of course, never saw any iron kettle. But what the coins Breen describes, and this is interesting, how he received these coins. He received them in a sack lined with New Haven newspapers. He describes it as a leather sack. Breen observed that the Stack brothers lived on Long Island, making it unlikely they used New Haven newspapers just to deceive him. That was actually a thought that Walter Breen had, because as we'll go through this is Walter Breen really at his best. I don't think there's any doubt that Walter Breen had some form of a mental illness. But in 1951, and when he deals with this hoard, he is really deadly serious. And he investigates the hoard as best he can from his perspective of a couple of months after the hoard is discovered. But one thing from looking at Breen's working notes that becomes eminently clear, and I also wish to make this clear, Walter Breen believed greatly that the hoard was authentic. So Walter Breen, what he did was, well, he's got this sack of coins. To Walter Breen's everlasting credit, the Stacks family, the Stacks brothers, Ben, Morton, all of them, they did not appreciate what it was that they had in their possession. It was Walter Breen who saw the hoard and recognized it for what it was, something of great colonial numismatic significance. And if it wasn't for Walter Breen, we wouldn't know anything about these coins at all. We wouldn't know anything about the hoard. It was Walter Breen who realized what they were and brought the hoard to light. So what Walter Breen began to do is really, and I deal with police officers and detectives all the time, begin a detective work into the hoard. And so what he did, and what his notes make clear, is he goes about interviewing all of the Stack family members individually, away from one another, asking them about what they know about the hoard, keeping copious notes about what they tell him, discounting things that he doesn't believe, and so forth, and really going about what is a true detective's work. For all the things that he does with this hoard, the one thing that really you can't fault him with is the detective work that he does. I really cannot fault him on the way he goes about interviewing these basically witnesses to the hoard. I have many detectives who really could learn something from Walter Breen, to tell you the truth. So Walter Breen is really applying his genius to the hoard at this point. And he goes about and he talks to every single person. He takes down all the notes to try to determine get to the bottom of the hoard. The Stocks family seemed to provide, and this is important, information reluctantly to Breen, and showed little interest in preserving the coins or recognizing the historical value of the hoard, especially regarding the George III halfpence. Importantly, Breen did not financially benefit from the coins, and any suggestion that his writings were motivated by monetary gain is unfounded. The coins belong to his employer, whom Breen makes very clear in his notes he really doesn't like. Breen holds, I don't know these people, and I'm not disparaging the Stocks family, but he holds the Stocks family in a great deal of contempt, which actually might speak well of them. But Breen holds them in contempt, and he really holds Mortimer Stocks in great contempt. But he goes about investigating it, and it's important. So to those of you who may believe that the Stock family invented this story in order to sell coins, Walter Breen had to basically pry this story from the Stock family, and his notes make very clear that he had to pry the story from the family. And the story they give him is slightly inconsistent based on who he talks to. But it's not like they were like, oh yeah, Walter, print this up. It's nothing like that. The Stocks family, everything we know about the hoard comes despite the Stock family, not because of it. It comes from Walter Breen. So Walter Breen, again, did not benefit financially at all. These were not his coins. If these coins would have sold for $1 million, Walter Breen would have made $0. So if you think that Walter Breen, who did, as I've shown, have a fanciful imagination, he had nothing to gain from lying about this hoard, one way or the other. In a 1952 letter to Eric Newman, Breen mentioned that the counterfeit halfpence. So what happens in 1952, to give you some backstory, in early January 1952, Walter Breen publishes the first information on the Stephney hoard in the Numismatist, in an article dealing with hoards in which he mentioned the Stephney hoard. And it was from that article that Eric Newman, one of the great bright lights of our hobby, first learns of the hoard. Like Walter Breen, Eric Newman appreciated the significance of the hoard, and he immediately writes to Walter, telling Walter that he is interested in these George III halfpence, that group, that first 74 coins that are in the hoard. The ones that really, as we know now, as I've indicated, most of which were Machen's Mills, that Walter Breen believed were counterfeit George III halfpence. Eric Newman writes to Walter, and Walter writes back to him, because Eric wants to buy all of the George III halfpence, or as many of them as he can. Breen mentions that the counterfeit halfpence were likely, quote, still in a drawer at Stock's office, possibly no longer in mint state after being jostled around with other British-made counterfeits for several months. Again, why is this important? Because if you believe that the Stocks family made up this story in order to sell coins, the Stocks family treated really these George III halfpence, these Machen's Mills coins, one of which, as we'll discover later, eventually sells for $35,000 with absolute contempt. Stocks family could care really less about them. And that's what Walter Breen tells Eric Newman. Look, if you're interested in these, I don't have them, right? The Stocks family, they're probably in a drawer, kicking around with other coins. So keep that in mind. Now let's look at some of the coins themselves. When I look at the hoard here for you today, a lot of what we're going to talk about are the coins themselves. Because again, the coins are not made up. The coins are real. You can't get around that fact. And so the question is, what can be learned from the coins? this is the EAC coin. Most of these coins, as I indicated earlier, the Connecticut's, the bulk of the Connecticut's are bought by Norm Bryant, and they eventually make their way to the EAC 75 sale. If you're the person this evening who bought Randy Clark's EAC 75 sale book, you'll note if you go to the EAC 75 catalog itself, many of the catalog descriptions say Stephney Hoard. And you know that they're Stephney Hoard because Walter Breen is the one who's cataloging EAC 75. And he's saying this coin is one of the coins that I remember from the Stephney Hoard. And this is one such coin. This is lot 301 from the EAC 75, 1788 Miller 12.1-F1. It's hard to tell from this old image. This coin has basically disappeared from our numismatic memory. If one of you has it, I would really like to see it because by all descriptions of it, it's in mint state, virtually a pristine condition. 1788. So here is a 1787 Connecticut, which was graded MS 62. It was also sold as part of the EAC sale. And I want you to know, these coins, you've got a 1788 in virtually absolute mint condition, that like the day it was sold. Here you have a 1787 Connecticut, a 3340 Z2, which is an MS 62. If I go back to the 1788 coin, even today, this 1788 coin would be the finest known of this variety. Most of the coins that we'll talk about, took a note here, pull my note out. There are 101 Connecticut's that were in the Hoard, 60 of which were in unk condition, representing 74 varieties with 31 duplicates. So 60% of the Connecticut coppers in the Hoard are in mint condition. I have a very large Connecticut collection. I can only wish that 60% of them were in mint condition. Here is, somebody told me they had this coin. And tomorrow at our happenings, one of the things, the Connecticut table we're going to be looking at are Stephney Hoard Connecticut's. So hopefully we'll have a gathering of some of these coins. And somebody told me that they had this coin. I don't know if this is the one that they have, but this is a 1786 Miller 5.8F MS 62 plus. If you collect Connecticut's like I do, you'll know that most 1786 Connecticut's are in very bad condition. To find a MS 62 plus Connecticut is itself an extraordinary thing. So what you're looking at here, this is these coins now being sold in 2020. This is 70 years after the discovery of the Hoard. This coin is still in MS 62 plus condition. Here is a 1785 Miller 6.3-G1 in AU 58, also an EAC 75 coin. So what you have from the Stephney Hoard is an extraordinary gather of Connecticut, also, as we'll talk in a minute, Nature's Mills and other coins. This is really exceptional. And think about it. The best Connecticut was sold and Walter Breen never saw it. Now we'll start. Well, now we're going to do a little analyzing of the Hoard. In his 1952 monograph, this is the one that was published with the numismatist Green determined that the coins, quote, were buried in 1788 unless most of the Connecticut's were predated. He also speculated that it was, quote, fairly early in the year, as the 1788 dated coins were extremely few in proportion to the 1787s, and all the 1788s are choice mint state. In his later unpublished manuscript on the Hoard, Green expanded on the topic, offering 3 reasons for the burial date being early 1788. First, he noted that, quote, the latest discernible date on a piece is 1788. That makes sense, right? If you've got 1785 and 1788 coins in a hoard, you're not going to say, well, this hoard must have been buried in 1785. That just doesn't make sense because you have 88. So the last date on any coin in the hoard is 1788. So logically, obviously, the hoard had to have been buried after that date. Next, he points out that, quote, there are only a few pieces of this date, meaning 1788, excluding the numbers 179 through 181, which are those Vermonts, which we talked about earlier, which he believed were added to the hoard before it was given to him. There were only 8 pieces dated 1788 compared with 81 dated 1787. Green also argued that even if all the 20-odd coins sold before he saw the hoard were dated 1788, this date would still be underrepresented in the hoard. Green's third point as to why the hoard was buried in 1788, represented in his unpublished manuscript, was the same as that presented in 1952. That is, that the coins dated 1788, quote, are in mint condition, a thing true of considerably fewer of the 1787 and earlier pieces. So the logic here being, there are fewer 1788 pieces, and all of the 1788 pieces are mint condition. There are some 1787 pieces that are not in mint condition. Ergo, this hoard must have been buried in 1788. But I want to go back to this first point that Walter Green makes. That is that the hoard was buried in 1788, quote, unless most of the Connecticut's were predated. As we know now, our numismatic scholarship of Connecticut's, of Machen's Mills has advanced. And we know that indeed, many of these 1787 coins were actually struck in 1788. What happened, for those of you who are not students of Connecticut coppers, is James Jarvis received the Fugio contract. He knew that there was not enough copper in all of the United States to fulfill the contract. So he went off to Europe, not only to find more copper, but also to find someone who would actually make the copper coins for him. He couldn't find anybody who would make, he actually approached Bolton and other people, but he couldn't find anyone in Europe who would make the copper coins for him. So he returned to the United States in September of 1788. And when he did, he went immediately to Congress, and he basically blamed Congress for his failure to fulfill the Fugio contract. If you recall, he obtained the Fugio contract through a bribe. But that aside, he explained to Congress, you know, look, everybody knew that this was always a sham. There's not enough copper in all of America to make this. You can't void my contract now just because reality has hit home. Because because James Jarvis had only delivered a fraction of the coins that he was contractually required, that is Fugio's, to deliver to the United States of America in New York City. So Congress, I think it's September 14, 1788, voided the Fugio contract. 3 days before that, the Connecticut Mint, the authorized Connecticut Mint in New Haven, Connecticut, according to the records of the Mint, which both Randy Clark and I independently found, transcribed and published with the help of a lot of people in the Colonial newsletter, it describes that in September of 1788, all of the federal copper that was still on hand to be made into Fugios was moved over to the Connecticut mint side of the ledger and struck into Connecticut coppers. Why is that significant? Well, because no 1788 dated Connecticut copper was struck at the New Haven Mint. Every 1788 Connecticut copper, I hope I'm not bursting someone's bubble, is a contemporary counterfeit, probably the majority of which, not all of which, were actually manufactured in Machen's mills. So these 1788 coppers that Walter Breen is looking at are made not in New Haven, but in Machen's mills. That's the first thing you need to know. And they are not made from the federal copper, because the federal copper is made into 1787 Connecticut coppers. I believe if you collect Connecticut copper, you know that the Miller 33 obverse is very numerous. I believe it's because it's made all from this, but mostly from the federal copper that's being transferred over to the Connecticut side of the ledger. That aside. So it was in September of '88 that the Connecticut Mint basically starts to fold, because they're making coins for the last time in a last ditch effort out of the federal copper. The Connecticut Mint in New Haven closes sometime just before the end of 1788. All then of, some of the dies from the Connecticut Mint and some of the personnel, including Abel Buell's son, then go to work at Machen's mills. But these 1788 Connecticut coppers, the counterfeits that I'm saying were made at Machen's mills, were not, by and large, made in 1788, but rather made in 1789. Some 1788 dated Machen's mills Connecticut coppers are actually made as late, we believe, as 1790. So this backdates the hoard from the date that Walter Breen thought, early 1788, to probably mid to earlier, probably spring 1789. I believe that the last dated coin, the last struck coin from the hoard was struck sometime around 1789. And this fact then becomes important. Those of you who are also students of colonial numismatics know what happens in 1789. In 1789, you have the copper panic of 1789. And copper coins basically drop just like colonial currency to almost no value pretty quickly. And so the price and the value of coppers across the board precipitously drops. What does that mean? What happens when a coinage goes from having value to having no value? That means somebody out there is left holding the bag. Left holding the bag of coins worth nothing, which then provides a motivation to bury the coins. Because at this point, these coins are worthless. And so the person who's burying the coins, for all practical purposes, believes that they're burying worthless items, which provides a greater motivation in my mind to bury mint state Connecticut coppers and other coins. It's the 1789 copper panic, I believe, which is the great motivator for the hoard, for the person to bury the Connecticut coppers, not some random date in 1788, but the copper panic of 1789. Let's look at the next sort of, Walter Breen got a lot of things right about the hoard. Jen, you really cannot, I cannot at least, criticize Walter Breen for dating the hoard at 1788. The reasoning that I went through is logical. It's not illogical, but we just now know more information than we did in 1952, than we did when Phil Mossman looked at this hoard 20-some years ago. We have taken great leaps and bounds in our knowledge, and we know that these 1788 were by and large made 1789. This story here about the hoard is probably Walter Breen at his worst, if I could say. Early on, and I'll say this like a bad detective, Walter Green came up with a theory about who buried the hoard and why they buried the hoard. And of course, Walter Green picked his favorite person to bury the hoard, a small boy. So he believed that a small boy buried the hoard, and that he probably gathered these coins up over a period of a couple of years, hence the great diversity of varieties. When we look at the boy theory of burying the hoard versus the theory that I just told you about the 1799, 89 copper panic, it really sort of, I believe, fades into the background. So Walter Green was laboring under the belief that the 181 copper coins, if they were buried in 1788 or thereabout, were worthless and were probably the coins of a young boy. Because they were worthless, and this young boy then must have gone and buried this worthless group of coins. Well, it really doesn't wash. First off, in 1787, 1788, you have to look at, and it's important to put into perspective, what was 181 copper coins worth? At that time, were they worthless? What could you buy? In a context that makes sense to us, what could you get? What was it worth, 181 coins? After Randy Clark and I, first Randy and then I, independently discovered the papers, the ledgers, some of the ledgers for the Connecticut Mint, I conducted an analysis of the Connecticut Mint. The Connecticut Mint paid its employees, surprise, in Connecticut coppers. And so we can have a very good sense of what a copper is worth by looking at how much was paid in copper to the various types of employees. Abel Buell, this may come as a shock to you, was a great believer in child labor. And so there were many boys, a great many boys, who worked at the Connecticut Mint, and they were paid in copper as well. There was also a slave who worked at the Connecticut Mint. There were also skilled craftsmen, master, and there were apprentices. So when we look at these records, a unskilled adult worker would receive about 4 shillings a day in pay. So when we look at how much 181 coppers is worth, it's basically about a week's wages for a young boy. But here's the other thing. If you're a young boy in 1788 and you're working in a factory of some sort, you're not making that money. You're making the money, but the money's going to your dad, right? This is not like today. If you worked in 1787 as a young boy, all that money went home. If you were a slave, all the money went to your master. If you were an apprentice, all the money went to your master. Boys did not run around with loose change in their pockets in 1787 and 1788. And therefore, I think that we can pretty much entirely dispel the young boy theory, particularly if we believe that this hoard originates from Stephney, because Stephney is not the more industrialized New Haven, but rather a farming community. And when a currency collapses, who is the stuckee of the coins? Well, it's usually the root, so to speak, the farmers from the country. They're the ones who are left really holding the bag. Merchants sometimes get stuck, but usually it's the farmer who's coming to town, who's stuck with the worthless Connecticut coppers and coppers of various types. So Stephney actually is a pretty good place where we would expect somebody who got stuck with a bunch of coppers to have been from. Let's look now at some of the Machen's Mills pieces. Those of you who have been sitting patiently, waiting for Machen's Mills to come up in greater detail, here you go. If you read our now award-winning book on Machen's Mills by Howells, Trudgeon, and Rosen, not necessarily in that order, you'll see a history of the study of Machen's Mills. Basically, the first person to look at Machen's Mills was excuse me if I butcher his name, McDowell Dickinson, who basically only briefly sort of mentioned Machen's Mills. Maybe he adequately described one. He didn't even call it Machen's Mills, but he called it a mill on the Great Pond. But he did not identify coins from the Hoard. And Crosby mentions Machen's Mills. As we all know, he has the indenture to Machen's Mills and goes into great detail about the mill itself. But Crosby does not add much so far as what coins were made there. The person who really advances the ball on Machen's Mills, the first great student of that study is actually the great C. Willis Betts. And Betts was able to adequately identify most of the coins that were struck, most of the counterfeit British coppers that were made in Machen's Mills, and that was in 1886. But Betts's contribution, he had woodcuts from which it's very difficult to discern some of these coins. Also, while Betts's treatise is fantastic, it's also extraordinarily rare. But there is a gap of over 50 years then in the scholarship to the mid-1940s in Machen's Mills. But the people who start writing in 1947 about Machen's Mills are themselves not even aware of Benjamin Betts's great work in identification of the coins that come from Machen's Mills. Why is that important? Well, if somebody is collecting, there's a lot of people who would tell you that the Stephney Hoard is a modern collection of coppers. Well, if that's the case, if you look at this black 672A, it really isn't described adequately until Black does so after the discovery of the Hoard. After Walter Breen describes it, after Eric Newman purchases this coin from the Hoard. So at the time Eric Newman purchased this coin from the Hoard, there was probably very few people on earth who would have looked at that and said it was a Machen's Mills product. So how was somebody collecting Machen's Mills coins in 1950 if they don't know what a Machen's Mills coin is? So this is one of the discoveries from the Hoard. The real great piece that's discovered from the Hoard is this piece here. This is probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous coins from the Hoard. This is the 1776 black 9-76B. This is the coin that sold for over $32,000. I've got the actual price coming up later. But it's a monster coin. It's a monster coin. But at the time Newman bought it, it was Newman who first brought this coin to life. It was Newman who first, now I think that Jim Rosen does correctly criticize some of Newman's scholarship, but nonetheless, Newman's right. This is a Machen's Mills product. But he does that in 1958. So how was somebody collecting Machen's Mills coins in 1950 if it's not until 1958 that we even know this is Machen's Mills? When Walter Breen is looking at these coins in 1951, he thinks this coin was manufactured in Birmingham. He thinks that this coin and several of these coins that were made in Machen's Mills that we now know were made in Machen's Mills were actually made in Birmingham. And he believes that none of these coins were actually made in the United States of America. At the time that Newman pulled that coin out of the Hoard, he believed it was unique. Here's Newman's notes. You'll see that the word unique is crossed off because later there's a couple more of these black 9-76B coins that are found. But at the time, that coin was an R9. There was no other coin like it. Nobody knew about it. But yet that coin is represented in the Hoard. So although it was unique in 1951, now it's dropped down to an R6 plus. Today, it's probably, when we look at the Hoard, one of the interesting things about the Hoard is it's probably the rarest coin from the Hoard. Most of the coins that constitute the Hoard are, no, We would describe them today as basically R4, R5s. Really no premium for them. And the other thing that's interesting about the Hoard, when we look at the Hoard, when I went through the Hoard, you'll note that there were no New Jerseys in the Hoard. There were no Massachusetts cents in the Hoard. There are no rarities in the Hoard. That is today what we consider an R8, an R7, an R9. The Hoard mostly constitutes pretty much, we know now, a common coin. Although in 1950 they were rare, today when we have a better idea of rarity, they're not rare. So they're more in line with the type of coins that you would expect to pull from circulation rather than a collection of coins that constitutes rarity and so forth. Yeah, even today, that coin that Newman bought from the Hoard remains the finest known example of that variety. So when you look at the Hoard and you consider that of the Connecticut's, of the 100-some Connecticut's, 60% are Unk, then it constitutes when you look at the Machen's Mills portion of the Hoard, you're looking at several of the finest known and also Unk examples of Machen's Mills coins. This is an extraordinary grouping of coins. Another thing you all should know about Walter Green is he was a pretty good drawer. This is his rendering, and it gives you a better idea. So now let's place, as I close, the Stephney in its geographical location. I think there are questions about, I believe there are legitimate questions about the legend of the Hoard, where it was found, how it was found, the city where it was found. Norm Bryant, right after he began, after he purchased most of the Connecticut's, went to Stephney. People told him there was no barn torn down around here from the Civil War era. He asked the clerk, he couldn't find anything that met the description of the barn being torn down. Phil Mossman also took a trip up to Stephney trying to find the same information. He could find no barn that had been torn down in Stephney. There is a likelihood that the story behind the Hoard's finding is fabricated. That doesn't mean that the Hoard itself is fabricated, because as we know, maybe somebody who finds a Hoard on somebody else's land might come up with a story that hides the fact that they basically are not the true owner of the coins. There could be many reasons why the owner fabricated the story, the origination story of the Hoard, but didn't fabricate, of course, the Hoard itself. But if we assume that Stephney, Connecticut, and Fairfield County, Connecticut, is the source of the Hoard, then we can learn a lot of the reasons about why the Hoard is the way it is. If you look where Green is written, Orange Lake in Newburgh, that's Machen's Mills. If you look where he says Hoard site, that's Stephney. If you look down there with Morris Cove, that's where the Connecticut Mint is, the legitimate, authentic Connecticut Mint. And if you look way up in Vermont, that's Rupert. And so if we consider Stephney is really on the road between New Haven, Connecticut, and Machen's Mills. So it would not be unusual to find a grouping of coins that were gathered in that small town in 1789 to constitute what? Connecticut coppers and Machen's Mills coppers. It's very logical that it would. And also, you can learn from the Hoard that coppers, state coppers, New Jersey coppers, Massachusetts coppers were not in circulation in abundance in rural Connecticut in 1789. With that, I will leave you all with the rest of the mysteries of the Hoard. At this point, I've written about 45 single-space pages on the Hoard. I'm sort of giving you some Hoard highlights. It's one of those topics that we can talk about till the cows come home, and I don't intend to labor the point anymore now. But I will turn it on to now people can give me all the conspiracy theories on the Hoard, starting with Dr.
Two questions. You initially said that if they'd been buried in an iron kettle, would that have caused some electrolysis or some kind of change in the coins? What was your finding there? And the second question is, the non-Mason mills, George, King George, Irish and British coppers that were non-Mason mills, what do we know about that?
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll deal with the first part of your question. First part of the question deals with the electrolysis and the possibility that an iron kettle, like the first three slides that I showed you, could have actually safely held a hoard for over like 150 years.
Okay.
Dr. Mossman did a very scientific analysis of the kettle, bringing in a group of scientists to look at just that question. Could an iron kettle keep this hoard in the condition that it was? And his conclusion was that it could.
Okay.
With regard to the non-nations portion of the hoard, some of that first grouping, if I were to go back, sorry, the flash is probably it.
There were a lot.
Yeah, there are a lot. There's 70 some in that original grouping. Some of those coins are lost to history. Unlike the Norm Bryant purchased Connecticut coppers that end up in EAC 75 and can be identified from the EAC 75 catalog, and unlike the Machen's Mills coins purchased by Newman, which didn't show up in Newman's sale, the rest of this Irish half-pence, British and Irish, what bring all these coins are lost to history.
That's a shame.
It is a shame. A couple more. Leanne has.
We have a question from online. Which issue of the C4 newsletter did you publish your write-up of the Connecticut Mint's ledgers in?
Oh, it was
a
one. No, the Connecticut ledgers. It's actually published in two issues of the Colonial newsletter. It's one of the last. This last and second to last. I believe that's right. The last and second to last of the CNL. You can go. Whoever's asking that question, you can go to the Newman portal, and it's on the Newman portal. We probably ended up publishing, I would say, about 130 pages of the ledger. We very fastidiously went through because it's handwritten, and so we deciphered every word. We had a team of people who agreed on the words. Randy Clark had one team that worked independent from a team that I had with Gary Trudgeon and Julie Casey and others. And so then what we did is both teams decided what they believed the ledger said, and then we came together and we looked at the differences that we had, and then we reconciled the differences. So we went about deciphering the ledger as carefully as we could. And it's really a treasure trove of original documentation concerning the Connecticut Mint. It's unfair in some ways to call it the ledger of the Mint. One of them is more a piece of the ledger of the Mint. The other is really a ledger book that was kept by the Leavenworth brothers, but it's really a treasure trove of the Mint. Yes. All right. One more question by Mr. Pearson.
Real quickly, if you do the math, that paid $1.38 coin, which are basically encrusted British half pennies in Connecticut. Now, time is 1951. And I don't know what the going rate was for colonial coppers, but $1.38 a piece doesn't seem that crazy to me at the time.
No, it wasn't.
So I don't think you really ripped them off. I mean,
no, they were only ripped off in hindsight. Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
it was a great.
Yeah, they were right. I think that I'm sure whoever got paid the $250 laughed all the way back to Connecticut with the money. Yeah, I don't believe they intentionally ripped anybody off. Yeah. All right, Joe, go ahead.
That one more. So based on what's in the collection, the variety spread, the year spread, do you believe this is a random pull from circulation, or was this an early collection?
Yeah, that really is the most difficult question to answer. I'm going to side on the fact that it is points pulled from circulation rather than a collection. Some of the facts that mitigate against that are the few duplicates that constitute the hoard. Many people believe that perhaps there was maybe a young boy or someone else in 1789 who's a collector of things. There's a possibility even that the person could have been an employee of either Machen's Mills or the New Haven Mint or both, and was saving some of the things that they were making, or had somebody in their family who was there. There's lots of possibilities, but I believe it's probably things pulled from circulation. When you look at, there was a 1787 study that was conducted in New York City in 1787 of coins in circulation in New York City in 1787. And while it leaned towards New Jersey coppers rather than Connecticut coppers because of its proximity to New Jersey, with respect to the overall content, it matched very closely to the Stephney Hoard. And that was one of the things that Phil Mossman relied upon for his belief that it was an actual coins. Well,
Like studying this out.
Mossman reprinted it, cited it. All right, well, that concludes my talk on Stephney.